think the important point to make is that violence, well, rather than escalating, it's at a high level. That's it. Part of the purpose of the study was to compare the rates from 2008 to see whether or not there had been any change. And what we've seen is that there actually hasn't been any decrease, but at the same time, there actually hasn't been a significant increase. Now, that obviously is cause for concern, because it means that we do need to intensify the resources that we're putting towards this problem and look at the strategies that we do use. But I think we also need to be careful to say that, it isn't escalating, it's staying constant, but at a high rate. The 2008 survey was really intended to set a baseline against which we could measure any change. Now, this 2012 study is the first time we've gone back and been able to collect data on a national level. And so what we've tried to do is to compare as much of the data as possible, whether it's where the violence is happening, what the extent of the violence is, things like corporal punishment, the relationship between what's happening in schools and what's happening in the homes. We tried to compare that to the 2008 study so that we can see where the sort of nuances and the dynamics are. Corporal punishment is a key issue within schools, simply because we know that was banned in 2007 and yet it continues to be used, and it can impact on the way that learners learn to resolve violence, how they learn to respond, the approach that they take to discipline and how they understand discipline. So the fact that corporal punishment is showing a slight increase is cause for concern. We also see that there's a very strong relationship between levels of violence and bullying. So we explored bullying as a distinct category of violence. And what the data showed is that where young people are being bullied, it increases the risk of other forms of violence. So what we have is a sort of intensified vulnerability, multiple vulnerability, where those who are most vulnerable to being bullied are also most vulnerable to being robbed, to being sexually assaulted. What that does do is it provides us with some sort of good entry point in terms of targeted interventions. I think also the fact that there is a very strong relationship between what happens in the schools and what happens at home. We found that 23% of the learners we spoke to had siblings who had been in jail, and 12% had caregivers who had been in jail. Now, one of the well-substantiated risk factors for violence, both in the national and international literature, is exposure to role models and family members who engage in criminality. So when we see that so many learners are surrounded by peers and by role models who should be setting good examples for them, but rather obviously have had some contact with the law, that really raises concern for us in terms of how we go about dealing with the levels of violence and victimization that young people are experiencing. Yes, absolutely. I think even weapons within schools, we had 9% of young people who said that they could easily access weapons. We had rates of up to 33, 40% in some cases saying that they could easily access alcohol, drugs of different types within schools. I think the highest was marijuana, where we had around 44% of learners say that they could access marijuana easily at school. I think obviously their role is to teach, but at the same time they have to maintain, they have to be present in the classrooms, they have to maintain control of the classrooms. I think obviously a very topical issue right now is that of teachers' presence at schools. And for me, it's not so much whether or not teachers are coming to school and arriving at school, but it's whether or not they're actually engaged in the classroom. Because often what one finds, and it came up in this study and it's come up in other studies that have been conducted over the last few years in schools in South Africa, is that you see teachers at schools but not necessarily in the classrooms. One point that often gets made, which certainly has some validity, is that often teachers are faced with classrooms of 45, 50 learners, and it's very hard to maintain control. But if you look at the national average of ratio, the national ratio of teachers to learners, we're looking at around 37%, and we certainly found those sort of ratios in our study. So I think it's more around the fact that they're in the classroom, that they are teaching, that they've got control of the class.
We actually are very aware of the fact that we're receiving a lot of complaints relating to corporal punishment, and we also are aware that our teachers are aware that corporal punishment has been banished from our schools. It's a matter of serious concerns to the council that a lot more complaints and reports are filtering through to our organization in terms of teachers engaging in corporal punishment. That is a worrying factor. Basically, one of the key things that we are doing currently, it's reaching out to as much of our teachers as possible, trying to make them understand the aims of applying corporal punishment on the learners. As my other guests correctly spoke here, Corporal punishment manifests itself in the fact that you then are teaching our learners that to resolve problems you need to be violent, which is a very problematic kind of situation. But we are running a lot of countrywide outreach programs, trying to speak to our teachers, trying to make them aware that they are not allowed to engage themselves in corporal punishment. But I believe that this is not enough on its own. We need to step up more programs, and also the question of assisting our teachers to understand what are the alternatives out there to corporal punishment, because the number of complaints that we're getting from them is that we have alternatives to corporal punishment, but they are not implementable. And therefore, we need a program together with all other stakeholders, the Department of Education, to say how do we make these alternatives to corporal punishment more practical, more applicable to our teachers, and therefore, we believe in developing and assisting our teachers would be able to win this battle.